Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the internet. It is my great privilege to be joined here today with Professor Rocco Buttiglione, who, if you don't know who he is, I don't know how. He's a man of many accomplishments. He served in the Italian Parliament for 24 years, I believe, in both houses of the Parliament. Studied under Augusto Del Noce, knew Luigi Guissani when he was young. He also wrote our new book here, Modernity's Alternative. And these accomplishments are in no particular order. He also knew John Paul II and knew Pope Francis as well. And he tells me he even knew Russell Kirk.
I did.
People on many continents. So I am here today. I would like to speak with him about his life, not just as a catalog of mirabilia, a catalog of wonders, because human life is not really about the things that happen to you, but about, life is what it is, and you must learn to live it somehow or other, and we grow. So I would like to speak with you about some of the things you have done, because it will be interesting, and also about the growth that occurred along the way, such as it may have been. If we could start, I suppose, at the beginning, where did you grow up?
It's a rather difficult question, because my father was in the Italian police, and the Italian police is a national institution, and they move the chief officers every 2 years. So I have grown up in Italy. In the first 18 years of my life, I've been in 9 or 10 different cities. Among them, Torino in the north, Catania in the south, Sicily, and Rome in the middle.
And that would have been...
But I was born in Gallipoli. Oh. Gallipoli is a Greek city. We are Greeks originally. We went there 27 centuries ago, and Gallipoli means the beautiful city. For those of you who study philosophy, I remember that in the state of Plato speaks of, they have translated the ideal city, but Plato writes Callipolis, the beautiful city, my city.
So that would have been... at least in part before the Second Vatican Council, is that right?
Yes. I was born in 1948. 15 years before the Vatican Council.
So I, of course, am from the United States, and I have very little understanding of Italian culture, and certainly not back then. That would have also been just after World War II, so there would have been some amount of rebuilding and trying to reconstitute the country at that point. What was... I suppose the question I want to ask is, what was the church to you growing up?
Oh, when I was growing up?
Yes.
A place in which there were priests who held long homilies, absolutely boring, and young people of the Catholic Church, I didn't like them. They did not make sports. They did not court girls. They always were watching their own feet in order not to see anything that could be a temptation. I did not like them very well. And my family had no great Catholic tradition.
I suppose you were Catholic in some sense, however, growing up.
Well, I received the baptism, yes, and very little more.
So at what point in your life did you start taking the faith more seriously?
Well, one day, my elder sister came home and said, on Saturday afternoon, there is a meeting of a group of young people I want to attend. She did not say of Catholic young people, of young people I have met. They seemed to be interesting. I was the smaller brother, and I went with her. And there I met Don Luigi Guissani. No. It was in Tre Castagni, near Catania. Giussani said, he smoked cigars, Italian cigars, very strong, Toscani. And he said, and he read the passage of the gospel where Jesus promises to his disciples the eternal life and 100 times more in this life. And he said, if you are not interested into eternal life, I understand you. You don't know what it is. But is it possible that you are not interested in 100 times more on this earth, 100 times more tenderness in the first love for a girl? That was particularly appealing to me. 100 times more intensity in sport, in study, in engaging yourself in life, in work tomorrow. If you don't want this, I do not understand you. And one of us said, well, that would be fine, but how is it possible? And he said, come and see. I went, and he added, I do not promise you a life without suffering. You will suffer. But I promise you, you will never get bored again. I went, I saw, well, after 60 years, I must say he kept his promise. My life was full of sorrow and of joy, but was never boring.
And that's what Christ says in that passage of the gospel, I believe. You will have it 100 times more with suffering.
With suffering, yes. Well, Giussani was very faithful to the text. He represented the text, but with an utmost fidelity to the text.
And what year would that have been? How old were you?
Oh, I think I was 13.
13.
It was 1961.
And that was before Giussani had started what's now called Communion and Liberation. Is that true?
Of course. It was called Gioventù Studentesca.
And what does that mean in English?
Student youth.
Oh, so it was just...
It is interesting, the title. We were not a Catholic organization. We did not speak to Catholics. We speak to everybody, Catholics, Jews. We thought that we had found a treasure of life. And we invited everybody to participate in this new life. Many of us came from not particularly religious family, like myself, for instance.
And so you met Giussani himself at the first meeting you went to?
Well, no. The first meeting, there was Don Ciccio. He was a priest of Catania who was in contact with Giussani. Giussani came after a few months, and we had one day together with him near Catania in Trecastani, on the slopes of the Etna volcano.
So I guess Don Ciccio was interesting enough to get you to stay long enough to meet Giussani.
Yes.
And you remained involved in that for a number of years.
Yes, 60 years.
60 years. Well, yes. I meant as a young man. And now, when was it you first went to Poland?
Oh, there was another priest of Comunione e Liberazione who was Don Francesco Ricci. Ricci was very tall, 6'6", more or less, and very slim. And they called him Don Quixote. I was smaller and broader, let us say. And they called me Sancho Panza. And Ricci had many friends in the communist countries. Friends in the persecuted church, friends in the underground culture, in the underground university. And with a group of us, he smuggled books, forbidden books, to the communist country, I to Poland, others to other countries, and brought back forbidden manuscripts because those who were not in line with the government, the non-communists, they could not publish, or they have very little occasions to publish anything. And there was an underground publishing. It was in Russia, they called it samizdat, self-edition. and it was typed on typing machines. There were no computers in that era, and everybody could copy 4 or 5. Who could make 4 or 5 copies, and we brought some of this to Italy and published them. We had a small publishing firm in Forlì, and we published most of the important authors who became famous after the fall of communism. One of them was Václav Havel, and one of them was Cardinal Wojtyła.
Well, we'll certainly come back to Wojtyła. The publishing house, the small one you mentioned, that's Jaka Book?
No. Jaka Book was connected, but was another thing. It was called CSEO, CSEO, Centro Studi Europa Orientale, Eastern Europe Study Center.
I believe now it's called CSEO Incontri.
I
don't know. I've seen that name on a book somewhere. So what age would it have been that you first went to Poland?
Well, I don't remember exactly, but I can tell you that the first article of Wojtyła that we published was in 1967, November 1967, and it was Chrześcijanin i kultura, Christian and culture. And I was 19 years old.
19?
19.
Had you already begun studying philosophy at that point?
Not quite. I studied law.
Oh.
In order to avoid conflicts with my family, I did not study philosophy, I studied law. But it was very good. I loved it very much. And later I made my doctoral thesis on history of political doctrine. That was a teaching of the faculty of law. And there I met Augusto Del Noce.
So what is it that made you interested in studying with Augusto Del Noce?
Well, first of all was the Don Ciccio, the priest of Catania. He put into my hands a book of Del Noce, The Problem of Atheism. I was 16, and I read this book. I did not understand very much. Probably I didn't understand anything, but I was fascinated. And Ciccio also, he was an extraordinary personality because he was the first person who did not take me seriously. That is, the first person who took me seriously. I pretended to be an intellectual, and he told me, no, you need to stay with the other people your age. You must go to make social service in the poor boroughs of the city. You must learn what life is. You must also start to look at girls. You will become an intellectual later if God wants, not now.
But he gave you a book of Augusto Del Noce.
But he gave me this book of Augusto Del Noce.
Was that to prove that you were not an intellectual?
No, I don't know why he did it, really. Perhaps he did not know exactly what to do with that copy, and he wanted to get rid. Who knows? In any case, it had an impact. Then my father was moved to Torino, and in Torino, I went to the Liceo Massimo d'Azeglio, the most anti-Catholic and anti-clerical school of Italy.
Oh.
Most of the leadership of the Communist Party came from Massimo d'Azeglio, and also of the lay culture in general. But there was also a very small, aber pugnacious group of Catholics there, and the son of Augusto Del Noce was a student of Massimo d'Azeglio, like his father had been before. And we became friends, and through him, I met his father.
So you had met Augusto Del Noce before you began studying with him?
Oh, yes. I remember his home. It was, very difficult to describe. It was full of books everywhere, and enormous confusion. But in that confusion, Del Noce knew exactly where each of the book he needed was located.
So you did I don't know if the American terms and the European terms are different here. You said you did a dissertation on law or history of...
No, on history of political doctrines. And it was on the controversy between Marx, and Bauer.
And you did that under Del Noce.
Yes.
So you had been studying law, and then you started studying political doctrine philosophically.
Yes.
And were you...
And later I moved to political philosophy, or philosophy of politics.
Were you already at that time smuggling books into Poland?
Oh, yes.
Now, how regularly were you going to Poland?
It depends, because they did not want us to go there, and they tried to put obstacles to have the permission to go to Poland. And not in these first years when I was just a very young boy, but later, I had my personal Secret Service agent. When I landed in Poland, each one of us had his agent, and he usually came to make us proposals for illegal activities in order to be able to blackmail us, or illegal or any case activities that would disgrace us in front of the public opinion. They proposed us to go warring. They proposed us to buy smuggling wares, but not books, wares with which you could make money, among them drugs. They would propose us to exchange the currency in the black market, because there was an official market that was absolutely unreal, with absolutely unreal quotations. And he knew that we knew. But then, nevertheless, he was a good communist bureaucrat, and he had to make this proposal all the same. Even if he wanted to do that kind of things, we would never have done them with him. But in any case, it was a formal, almost a formal procedure.
Was there any, how would I put it? Obviously, they were trying to get you in trouble there by getting you to do things, but did you ever feel unsafe is the wrong word, but did they threaten you at all, or was there any threat of violence?
Violence? Well, there was a certain level of danger.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Not very high. My Polish friends, our Polish friends, used to tell us, if they catch you, after a couple of weeks, the Italian foreign minister comes to Warsaw and brings you back home. If they catch us, they put us in jail. They throw the key out of in the Vistula, in the river. So when there was something particularly dangerous, well, we did it
instead of them.
And I must say, and this has been very important in shaping a certain idea of priesthood. When there was something particularly dangerous, Ricci would say, no, you can't do that. You have a family. I do that.
Before we move on to Wojtyła on the topic of Poland, I want to return to Augusto Del Noce, because you've mentioned the topic you wrote on, but what effect do you think it had on you, studying with Del Noce?
Studying with Del Noce? Well, I told you, I did not have, I do not belong to a traditionally Catholic milieu. I was raised in rather an anti-Catholic milieu in the Liceo. It gave me a great sentiment of freedom. We were not in the traditional Catholic culture. We were not, of course, in the anti-Catholic culture. We felt that we belonged to modernity. I am a modern man. I am not a man of the Middle Ages. But that modernity is a problem, not a solution. And the solution to this problem is the presence of Jesus Christ in history. That's what I have learned from Del Noce and from Don Giussani. Whilst most people thought, no, modernity is a solution. The church is the problem and modernity is the solution. We thought, no, modernity is the problem because we are modern. The cultural formation that I have had is modern. And I love modernity. But modernity is looking for its salvation. And the salvation of modernity is Jesus Christ. I found this a perfect formulation of this position many years later in the great homily of John Paul II at Parc des Princes in Paris, when he speaks of the essence of France and of modernity.
I haven't seen that one. Is in Port-au-Prince, you said?
Parc aux Princes.
Oh, Parc. I was thinking of the city in Haiti.
It's different.
But he went there too, I believe.
Yes, he did.
he went everywhere. So you said that Father Francesco Ricci would volunteer to do the more dangerous things because he didn't have a family. Were you married already at that time?
When we had this exchange, yes, I had been married for a few months.
No, so you were still smuggling books. When was it in going to Poland that you first met Karol Wojtyła?
I don't remember, but I cannot give you an exact date. But I can tell you how it happened. Well, I'm not speaking now exactly of myself. I was not there. But the first encounter between Wojtyła and the young people of Comunione Liberazione, I don't know whether this is true or not, because Ricci loved the truth too much to let her go around naked. He used to dress her up a bit. So Ricci told me, and I imagine that it must be essentially true, but I would not swear on each detail. The legend says that one day Cardinal Wojtyła was strolling around the village of Krosienko. Krosienko belonged to a movement of young Catholics. They were our brothers somehow. It was Światło życie, light and life. And there was a chapel. They had the house in Krosienko. We were the guests. And there was a small chapel. And Wojtyła passes by and hears people singing in a language that is clearly a Slav language. But he did not know which Slav language. He had been studying philology at the Jagiellonian University, so he's supposed to know all Slav languages.
All the Slavic languages, yes.
And Slavic languages. And he says to his secretary, later Cardinal Dziwisz, Stasiu. Stasiu is a diminutive of Stanisław. Stasiu, who are they? Perhaps Lusatian Serbs, a very tiny Slavish-speaking minority in Germany. And he enters and discovers that they are Italians singing in what we thought was Polish.
Yes. So you had been learning Polish already at the point, I suppose, since you were having to go back and forth to Poland.
A bit. But I really learned Polish only later. Because Ricci was convinced that Wojtyła was a great philosopher. But there was no introduction to the thought of Wojtyła in any Western language. And he said, you must write a book on Wojtyła, on the philosophical thought of Karol Wojtyła. I said, no, I cannot speak Polish, a few words, but I cannot. But it was impossible to say no to Ricci. He would never take no as an answer. And so I wrote, I began writing, and in the end, what came out was my book on the philosophy of Karol Wojtyła. And I brought it to Karol Wojtyła, as publishing firms always do, a book to the person who is the object, whose thought is the object of the book. And he said, oh, how could you write such a big book on the thought of a person who was taught so little as I did?
Now, the book was published, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this was the first book written on John Paul II's pre-papal philosophical thought. And I believe you published it in 1982.
1982.
When did you finish writing it? Was it then, or had it been finished earlier and it just languished unpublished?
Usually I write articles. Each chapter of my books, also the last book, originally was a lecture given in a certain place or a course given in a certain university, and then I put them together and make a book. So let us say the book has been written in the course of some years before 1980.
And it seems like a lot of things have happened to you because people came to you and said, you must do this.
Well, it is difficult to give this idea, but the experience of Gioventù Studentesca was an experience of real communio. And there was very deep friendship among the people. And it was, you determined what you were in the relation with your friends. And of course, some of these friends were more experienced. They had a deeper experience of faith, and they were leading figures. Ricci was a leader.
Is that also how you got involved in smuggling books into Poland?
Of course.
So you didn't volunteer for that?
No. Why don't you come with me to Poland? Let's go. By the way, I remember the first time Ricci told me, a lady, Wanda Gawronska, will come to pay you a visit. Listen to her and do whatever she says. And then Wanda, who, by the way, was the niece of Pier Giorgio Frassati, you know, the saint. A beautiful lady, blonde, very feminine. She arrives carrying with nonchalance a satchel. And she puts down the satchel and says, you bring this to Poland. You're leaving tomorrow, you bring this to Poland. I tried to lift it. It was extremely heavy. I was a strong man. I have been in the military, in the Grenadiers, and it was difficult for me. And she told me, and don't allow anybody to think that it is heavy. You must take it with, as if it were just a few items of laundry. And I have been always wondering, how could such a fragile lady carry such a heavy satchel?
Those are some of the secrets of book smuggling.
Yes. Well, there are. I could. It is not worthwhile because I imagine that now the technology of smuggling has changed completely. But there was a certain professionality of book smuggling. Yes. And we smuggled 50,000 Bibles. Not me. I smuggled the philosophy books, but my colleagues, my friends, smuggled 50,000 Bibles.
And were you involved in Jaca book at the beginning?
Yes, I was a great friend of Sante Bagnoli. Sante Bagnoli is the founder of Jaca book and one of the most original personalities of Comunione Liberazione. And we were friends.
Well, tell me about, you've mentioned the first time that Communion and Liberation came into contact with Wojtyła, but what about when you first met him?
Well, I was a boy in a crowd. He passes by, he shakes hands, he watches you in your eyes. He did not give his hand to be kissed. He shake hands. I had immediately the impression there is a man who would give his life for you if need be. And if there is such a man, and this man is not your father or your mother, not even your sister, this kind of love must have a supernatural root, or at least you remain with this doubt throughout all your life. And yes.
So that was when he was still a cardinal, and you were in Poland at the time. Yeah. And then, of course, he gets elected Pope in 1978, becomes John Paul II. How did you end up getting involved with him after he was Pope? Because as you say, you were a young man in a crowd when you met him.
Well, because of Ricci. Always because of Ricci. John Paul II, Cardinal Wojtyła, had the habit of gathering around him at a dinner or at lunch prominent intellectuals in order to discuss important issues that were important for the teaching of the church. Sociologists, philosophers, economists and so forth. And when he became Pope, he did the same. And he invited a certain number of Italian intellectuals. And he invited me too. And I suppose that Ricci gave him my name, because up to this point I knew him, but he did not know me. Or rather, he knew me through Ricci. Ricci told him about his friends, and the friends of Wojtyła were, of course, friends of Wojtyła. In those years, if you went to Krakow, well, everybody in Krakow was convinced of being the best friend of Cardinal Wojtyła. And in part it was true, because Wojtyła had a great, he was a man who looked at you and saw in you a great destiny. I suppose it to be a rather normal human being, rather boring. And no, he thought that I was interesting, that I could do something in life, that I had to do something in life. There is a poem that he has written in which he says, the salvation of the world is waiting on the threshold of your soul. You, in a certain sense, each one of us is the Messiah. The Messiah can enter into your life and make of you his own presence in the history of your family, of your city, of the world. And this was literally true. He had a great hope for each human being.
Yes. And you were already working on the book about him, I suppose.
Oh, yes.
And so you ended up publishing that 4 years after he became Pope.
It was published 4 years after?
It was 1982, I believe.
I think it was circulated before.
I see.
We have in Italy a thing that we call, I don't know the exact tradition, dispense. Dispense is a book that is not yet completely elaborated, but that is already used in teaching. You give it only to your students. I think it was a little bit before 1982. In 1982, you have the first formal edition with Jacob.
I see. So I suppose after that, you were, at least in some sense, an expert on his thought, because you had a book with your name on it about him.
Yes, I was an expert. Even before, because he had already some articles with my name.
So I suppose you got more involved with... I actually don't know what your involvement was with him exactly, because, of course, so many people knew him.
Well, which kind of involvement I had? I was a friend. And sometimes he would ask me to do this or that thing for him, and I would do that.
Like Francesco Ricci, or was it a different sort of asking?
Yes, I was moved to another kind of work, and also another kind of friendship of a more cultural character. To make one example, after a few years.
Oh yes.
When you deal with authoritarian regimes, communist or semi-fascist, you develop a particular kind of diplomacy. I was known in the world. My book had also editions in different languages, and I was known as an expert on the thought of Wojtyła and a friend of John Paul II. When the Pope wanted to say something, but could not say that, then he might send me to a certain country with the mission of saying what he could not say. Once in Paraguay, the bishops wrote a pastoral letter on the national dialogue. And the authoritarian regime of Stroessner, they were very angry to the bishops, said, oh, they are liberation theologists, they are Marxists, they are against the Pope. It was very difficult to support the bishop without entering directly into a collision with the government. Then I was invited to the Catholic University of Asunción del Paraguay to deliver a lecture on the thought of John Paul II. And the mission was very clear. I had to give the demonstration with texts of Wojtyła, not of the Pope, of Wojtyła as philosopher, that all what the bishop had said corresponded exactly to the thought of Karol Wojtyła. I went, and in the first row, there was the government. And I was greeted with particular enthusiasm by the Minister of Police. But I did not flinch. I did what I was supposed to do, and immediately after, I took a car and I rode to the border, not to the airport because they might have taken me, but to the border.
Is that how you first ended up going to Argentina?
No, I had already been in Argentina some time before. I went to Argentina in 1980, I think. Yes, 1980.
But was it John Paul II asking you to go there and do something?
Well, I don't know. It was Ricci. To me, Ricci was a kind of a right hand man of John Paul. Not really, but for us, yes. It was a connection, our connection in the beginning. Later, I had a direct relation.
You say in the book that you were going to Argentina to discuss what it meant that there was a Polish Pope and to give people the background on his thought and also on Solidarność a little later on.
Yes. Well, there are many things connected together. Ricci was in charge of the diffusion of the movement of Comunione Liberazione in the world.
Oh.
And so, in that time, he was particularly interested to Latin America. So I went together with Ricci, giving always lectures and classes in different universities. And one purpose was the diffusion of Comunione Liberation in Latin America. In Argentina, there was a particular situation. There was a military dictatorship, the so-called Seguridad Nacional, national security dictatorship. And there was a very strong workers' movement, very strong trade unions. And there was in Poland Solidarność. So we went to talk about the philosophy of Wojtyła, but also to talk about the Polish experience of Solidarność. And our idea was to make a bridge between Argentina and Poland, because Poland had a very strong workers' movement, but a workers' movement that was not Marxist, that was Catholic, that had as their fundamental theory Christian social doctrine, exactly like in Poland. So we tried also to mediate an exchange of experiences between the Polish movement and the Argentinian movement. And in this situation, there was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. The most important youth organization of Argentina was the youth movement of the Peronists. But the youth movement had a schism on the left.
A schism?
A schism on the left, yeah, a schism on the left. It was the so-called Montoneros. They were Marxist guerrilleros. And a schism on the right. It was the so-called AAA, Alianza Anticomunista Argentina. And they were murderers in the service of the military. And they wanted to divide the people, to assemble the people into warring camps to prepare the civil war. There was already a low-intensity civil war. They wanted to have a real civil war, and they tried to divide the people, to say, you must make a choice. In the middle, there was a third movement that was called Guardia de Hierro. And they wanted to struggle against the dictatorship, but without violence, just like Solidarność in Poland. And the cultural, intellectual, not political point of reference of this part was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. The political leader was Alejandro Alvarez, and they had a group of intellectuals, philosophers, sociologists, that worked together with them or in dialogue with them. Amelia Podetti, Fabio Bellomo, and on the ecclesiastical side, Lucio Hera, Rafael Telio, and Juan Carlos Cannone.
Who were priests.
They were priests. And Jorge Mario Bergoglio. Bergoglio was, when I met him, he was the rector of San Miguel.
San Miguel,
San Miguel was a kind of theological academy of the Jesuits.
So that was
80.
Just after he had been the provincial?
Yes, he had been the provincial, but he was not re-elected, and they were sent in a kind of golden exile in San Miguel. Later, for some reasons, he was further degraded and sent to Cordova.
Sent into a less golden exile.
Cordova was not golden. It was exile, but not golden. Then Cordova was enough, and they sent him to Germany. And then he was called back by Antonio Guarracino. When Guarracino was named the Bishop of Buenos Aires, he called Bergoglio as his coadjutor bishop.
Now, Guarracino was an Italian?
No. Yes, he was an Italian, of course. He was Argentinian. Every Argentinian must have at least a couple of grandparents who are Italian.
And why was he made the Archbishop of Buenos Aires?
It is a long story. We must begin with Puebla. The first thing John Paul II does when he's elected Pope is to go to the assembly of the conference of the Latin American Episcopate.
And I believe that St. Paul VI had already had the engagement.
Yes, and he wanted
to keep it.
To keep it, and he did. The main issue was the liberation theology. Medellin, 1969, had said the communion must become a community, must become a reality that can be sociologically seen, that enters into the life of the people and change the life of the people. And the great question was, what does this mean? And what is the relation between this and Marxism?
Now, if I could interrupt you for
Please,
a moment.
You always can.
For people who aren't as familiar with this, because of course I edited the book and you wrote it, in Latin America there were a series of conferences held by the bishops. I believe the first one was actually in Rio de Janeiro in the 1950s. This would have been under Pius XII. When was Medellin?
69.
69? And so at that point, they started receiving the Second Vatican Council and thinking through what it meant for the continent of Latin America. And Latin America is I believe, the only continent in the world where they did that, where they all got together and thought about it in conferences.
And the Roman Curia was very worried about this. And they constituted a papal commission to control them, the Papal Commission for Latin America.
Which still exists.
Yes.
In fact,
and Prevost was the president of this commission.
Yes, now Pope Leo XIV was the president of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America.
Commission for Latin America.
So in Latin America, there were these series of these conferences over the course of, I suppose, almost 60 years. Starting in the 1950s, but really Medellin is sort of considered the beginning of it because it was the first one after
Rio
the
de
council.
Janeiro was important also. It was a beginning.
Certainly it allowed them to have Medellin. I don't know nearly as much about it as you do, of course, but having already had one before the council would have made it easier to have a second one.
Yes.
And so, as you said...
May I say?
Yes.
Many people think that Pius XII was a reactionary, linked to the past, with no perspective for the future. This is not completely true. He had a certain idea of synodality, and Rio de Janeiro is a first experiment in synodality. Of course, a limited experiment. It is something completely new. The resistances were enormous, but you could never have Medellin without Rio de Janeiro.
I was actually looking at a book on Pius XII. There's an American scholar, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Vincent Easermans, something like that, and he edited quite a number of books on Pope Pius XII. One of them was he finished it just after Pius XII had died, and he writes in the introduction to it that Pius XII was the most modern pope. He says that he was he lists a number of things where Pius XII liked modern technology. He was the first pope to use the radio, to make radio addresses, which he did quite a lot, actually, instead of writing encyclicals.
Very important radio addresses.
And he also said
for Christmas,
yes,
every year.
He also said that Pius XII was the first pope to use an electric razor.
I don't know this.
That's what he said. And he said that Pius XII, I mean, as I say, he's an American scholar, so scholars always say that the popes like their own countries. But he said that Pius XII really liked Americans and gave, I think he said 89 addresses to Americans. Yeah. And he said at one point, because there were so many Americans coming in and out of the Vatican, that Pius XII, this is the story, turned to someone and said, "The Vatican is practically becoming an American institution." But yes, now he has this reputation as being the anti-modern figure. But just after he died in 1958, that's what a man was writing about him, that he was the most modern, first pope to use an electric razor.
This is perhaps an exaggeration, but also the opposite is an exaggeration. After all, he is the man who protected the career of Giovan Battista Montini and practically brought Giovan Battista Montini to become Paul VI.
Yes.
He cannot have been so reactionary.
So, as you said, Latin America is having this series of conferences of all the bishops of the continent. And starting in Medellin, they start thinking through, what do we do with the Second Vatican Council? What does that mean for us? And the question they were really facing there was, how did you put it? Having to do with the poor?
Yes, not only. One first important aspect of the new theology that will become liberation theology was we want to think the faith starting with the faith experience of the Latin American people. Latin America has a culture of their own, and you must think the faith within this culture. If you want to evangelize the Latin Americans, you must propose to them the faith within their culture. And you must take into account the fact that they are already living the faith within their culture. Because within a Latin American popular culture, you have a Latin American popular religiosity. The theologians were very diffident against this popular religiosity. They thought it was mixed up with pagan, pre-Christian elements, and it had to be purified, which in part was true. But they preferred to set it aside and to act as if they were Europeans. It was appalling in Buenos Aires to see theologians who knew everything on the last books of European theology and nothing about the religiosity of the people of the poor boroughs of the Villas Miserias, so-called, of Buenos Aires. And no, they wanted to think the faith starting with the experience of faith of the poor people. This was one fundamental element. And the other was, if we accept the idea that the faith is not just individual, but creates a community and a solidarity among the people, and this produces new and more human forms of life for man, then how shall we do that? What are the intellectual instruments through which we can imagine a social and political action of Christians in order to struggle against poverty and create conditions for a more human life for the poor masses of Latin America? To this second question, the answer of many, not of all, was Marxist analysis. We make use of Marxist analysis in order to... These were the 2 points. An original Latin American theology and the use of Marxist analysis. In Puebla, John Paul II says, yes, we want a Latin American theology. No, Marxist analysis has already failed in Poland. Why do you want to use it in Latin America? And the theology of the people, of the Argentinians, begins with, we want to make theology starting with the faith of the people, with one important qualification. The faith of the people must stand in a living relationship with the faith of the bishops. The bishop is not the originator of all life in his community. The Spirit produces life wherever it wants. But whatever is born must enter into a dialogue with the bishop, because only the bishop can tell you whether what you are doing is a reduction of Christ to your own measure, a Christ imagined in your fantasy, or a representation in history of the true image of Jesus Christ. And these were the two accents put by Wojtyła. Church of the people, yes, but in relation to the hierarchical church. And, please, no Marxist analysis. And more in general, not only no Marxist analysis, but social sciences are always a kind of social philosophy. They have philosophical presuppositions. Before using them for the pastoral of the church, you must be aware of their philosophical presuppositions and correct, if need be, their philosophical presuppositions.
So you had mentioned that Bergoglio at that point was selected to be a bishop by Guaracino.
Yes.
And so I had asked why Guaracino was the bishop of Buenos Aires, to try to understand why he would have picked Bergoglio. And you started talking about the difference between Medellin and Puebla to explain that.
Yeah. No, well, Guaracino was the bishop of Avellaneda. Avellaneda is one of the dioceses of the Great Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires is not a city, it's a human conglomerate with 10 or more millions of people. In it, there is the Diocese of Avellaneda. And he had been the secretary of the CELAM in the time of the preparation of Puebla.
And CELAM is the
Conference of Latin American Bishops.
So it's like the USCCB.
Yes. And there was a president, who was Alfonso López Trujillo, and the secretary general was Antonio Guaracino. And the president was a very cultured, intelligent, brilliant man, and was a terrible reactionary against liberation theology in all possible forms. Guaracino, on the other, was more in tune with Wojtyła and with the idea that there is a good liberation theology that must be helped to grow, while there is also a bad liberation theology. For a certain time, prevailed the idea that all liberation theology was to be condemned. Starting from a certain point, and through the impulse of John Paul II, the Curia becomes convinced that no, there are different forms of liberation theology. One is the Argentinian, but we did not want to call it liberation theology. At least Juan Carlos Cannone considered the Argentinian theology as a form of liberation theology. Bergoglio preferred to use, and Lucio Hera, they preferred to use the expression theology of the people, substituting the concept of people to the Marxian concept of proletariat, or also theology of culture. You must understand man in the context of his culture. It is the popular culture, the source of the struggle for the liberation, not Marxist theory. The Argentinians, the Central Americans, Hugo Asman, Pablo Richards, Emmanuel Cardinal, and they were Marxists. In the middle, there was Gustavo Gutierrez and the Brazilians. And with them, there was a dialogue, and in the end, Gustavo Gutierrez has written some of the most beautiful pages on the theology of the 20th century. And, I have a great admiration for him.
So it depends in part on what you mean by words. And some people chose to use liberation as an umbrella for all of it. And other people said, no, we prefer that word to be used only for the other things.
I liked the word liberation. And also John Paul II did. Once he said, we need a kind of liberation theology a little bit in the style of communion and liberation.
Yes, well, of course you like the word liberation with Luigi Guissani.
Because liberation is the presence of Jesus Christ in history. That's the liberation of man.
Yes, I mean, John Paul II, I believe it's in one of the documents from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on liberation theology, the phrase, an authentic theology of integral human liberation, as opposed to a false theology of economic liberation or something.
I think it is libertatis nuncius.
Yes. And then John Paul II quotes that phrase in Centesimus Annus.
Oh, yes.
But at least the second document, I believe it's the one you mentioned, Libertatis Nuncius.
Yes.
That one speaks about, as you say, Christ bringing liberation in history. And so certainly the church has something to say about what it means to be free. Yeah. Freedom is a theological category.
Theology of culture was less equivocal. Theology of liberation was, in that moment, was equivocal.
Yes.
So there were good reasons for one and also for the other denomination.
So Guaracino was more associated with the theology of culture, theology of
Yes, Guaracino was in one sense, not the leader, the protector of the group of theologians and philosophers who had prepared Puebla. And most of them were Argentina, not all. There were Lucio Hera, Alberto Metor Ferré, and other Argentinians. There was, Alberto Metor Ferré was not Argentine, it was Uruguayo. There was Guzman Carriquiri. There were the Chileans, Joaquin Allende, Hernan Alessandri, and others from other countries.
So, appointing Guaracino Bishop of Buenos Aires was, I suppose,
a clear decision. This is the right line.
A decision from John Paul II about the right line of the interpretation of the Second Vatican Council into the life of Latin America.
Yeah.
I
wish to make another name because the real great protector was Guaracino in Latin America was Cardinal Pironio in Rome. Now they have a cause of beatification. It was really a great church leader.
So that was the clear decision from John Paul, this large see in Buenos Aires, and as you say, the movement was Argentinian in its origin. So having their man, as it were, appointed to the major see was a clear sign from John Paul II that this was the line of thought that was realizing what he had said at Puebla about no to Marxist analysis, yes to Latin American theology.
He tried to reformulate this in Santo Domingo, but Santo Domingo produced very beautiful documents, but it was led too strongly from Rome, from the Curia, and these documents did not produce any effect, or a very limited effect.
So Santo Domingo was the fourth of the
conference.
Conferences in Latin America. That was, 1991, I believe?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
So then Guaracino selects Bergoglio to help him out with advancing this line of thought.
Yeah. And Bergoglio brought this line up to Aparecida, the last...
the fifth conference, where he was in charge of redacting the document.
And where really the bishops were the protagonists. They did all the work. There was no predetermined direction of their works.
It was like Vatican II in a way, where they had the prepared documents and they threw them out and then decided what they wanted to say. But do you remember the first time you met Bergoglio?
Yes, in San Miguel. I think the first time, yes. And I don't remember exactly what we did the first time, because he did not speak very much. He listened. And I remember better the second time, we created a magazine, the magazine Nexo, that has had an important role in the history of Argentinian theology. There was Bergoglio, there was Méthode Ferré, there was Ricci, I was there too.
So do you have any stories you think would be worth telling about Bergoglio, or I suppose some of the other figures in Argentina at that time? Anything you remember about them?
But particularly about Bergoglio, no, he was very. He was not so expansive as character as other Argentinians. He was very cautious.
So he was quiet and
very quiet.
Not too much sticks out as far as stories go.
To be an Argentinian, at least.
Well, what about Méthode Ferré?
Méthode Ferré was Méthode Ferré belongs to the theology of the people. Really, the first great leader was Lucio Hera, and it's a theology taught in order to avoid the civil war and to create an alliance between the Church of the Bishops and the Church of the People. There are not two churches; there are two sides of one church, and you cannot have a Church of the People without the bishops. You can have a Church of the Bishops without the people, but it would be extremely boring. So they must stand in contact with one another. And this is what also leads Bergoglio to Guardini. I don't think that Guardini derives his idea of the opposites that are compatible with one another and are different sides of a living reality.
The two poles.
Yes. You find it in Guardini, in the famous book Der Gegensatz. But I think that here Bergoglio found a confirmation of this, of what the Argentinian church had discovered in their own experience. The famous document on the national dialogue that was largely redacted by Lucio Hera. So, Méthode Ferré enlarges this vision. No, we don't want to have a Marx analysis. What shall we do? And then Méthode Ferré encounters Augusto Del Noce. He takes the idea of Del Noce of a transpolitical interpretation of history and transplants it from Europe to Latin America as an instrument. What is a transpolitical interpretation? It is an interpretation that says that the most basic level of the understanding of human action is not economic history. History has many layers. One layer is political history. You cannot really understand political history if you do not understand economic history, the way in which people make up a living, and the tensions that arise at the level of economy. But people are economically active on the basis of a certain self-consciousness, of the idea they have of themselves. All the economic values are surdetermined through cultural values. To make a very easy example, would you ever eat human flesh?
No.
Why? It has the same organoleptical qualities of pork. But you don't do that. No. Why? Because of culture. What is food is determined, co-determined, not only, but co-determined through your culture. And the quantity of time you're ready to work is determined through the understanding that you have of yourself. And the way in which you look at women, the way in all. So self-consciousness is the most basic level for the understanding of man and for the understanding of society. You understand man in culture. And the center of culture is the relation with God. The values to which you give an absolute loyalty. So, it is not a philosophy of history in the sense that it pretends to foresee the future. We don't foresee the future. But it helps you to understand what are the forces that shape history. And also this helps you to make use of all the human sciences, but detecting the ideological bias to which each one of them may be subordinated, and setting them free from that ideological bias. And this is a new stage of the theology of the people, one step forward for the theology of the people. And this implies a certain assimilation of the thought of Del Noce, and also, of course, of Centesimus Annus.
Yes, John Paul says that in there about the center of culture being the relation with God.
Yes.
That's in Centesimus Annus.
John Paul II does not arrive to this through Del Noce. He meets Del Noce, and in part through me, but he arrives to this through a particular phenomenological school of Krakow, through his study of phenomenology. In particular, there is Josef Tischner, who has written very well on this point. And he was the chaplain of Solidarność.
Now, we haven't mentioned at all your political career.
Oh, yes. Did I have a political... Yes, I did.
Now, why did you get into politics? It seems like you had plenty of things to do with your time.
Well, it was a mistake, an equivocation. I was in Liechtenstein. I was the prorector of the Internationale Akademie für Philosophie im Fürstentum Liechtenstein. And my secretary, the best secretary in the world, Elizabeth, she understood everything, could do anything, spoke all languages, with the exception of Italian. And she calls me and says, there is somebody who calls from Italy and wants to wants to talk to you. And I said, who is this? And she said, Mino Martinazzoli. He was the leader of the Christian Democratic Party. I had always been critical of the Christian Democratic Party, but I had always voted the Christian Democratic Party. And I say, and the bishops had said in a document that we must do something in order to avoid that the great tradition of political Catholicism in Italy dies out. And I said, well, yes. And I speak with Martinazzoli, and he says, Professor, can we make use of your name? And I thought, yes, why not? I imagine they will put my name under a manifesto supporting the Christian Democrats. And the following day, I read the papers, and I see that I had been nominated president of the Ethical Commission of the party. And here you see how important culture is. Having spent so many years in the culture of Liechtenstein, it was for me unthinkable that if there is a commission, she does not do anything. If there is a commission, the commission must produce a certain work. And if I am the president of the commission, I have the duty of organizing the commission in order to produce certain effects. And so I came back to Italy one day each week to organize this commission and to begin a struggle against corruption in the party. And only many years later, I realized that nobody expected me to do anything. They just wanted to be able to say, there is an ethical commission of the party and Buttiglione is the president. Stop. But then it was too late.
Were you actually able to reform any of the ethics in the party? Maybe I shouldn't ask.
Another question.
But is that how you got into the parliament too?
Yes, and then after the following elections, the party is practically dissolved, and the rest, I gathered the rest of the party. I enter in parliament, and I begin my not so fortunate political career.
Now, did John Paul II have anything to do with you getting into that? Did he encourage you to?
No. Well, I knew that he thought that it was good to enter in, to make politics. and that we needed the politics, and the Christian Democrats needed a new kind of politics, taking into account the Christian social doctrine that had been so dramatically renewed in the last years. But he never told you what you had to do. He always helped you to see, to understand by yourself.
So not like Francesco Ricci.
They had different temperaments.
And Guaracino, you said, was also very hard to say no to.
Guaracino was Argentinian.
Did you discuss your work in politics much with John Paul II?
No, never.
Never? Well, what did you talk about?
With John Paul II?
Yes.
Well, I kept helping with some documents. He discussed his documents with a group of friends. Let us say, he had some assistants. This was very similar to Del Noce. He was a professor.
Are there any stories about John Paul II you would like to tell? Any incidents you remember?
Oh, well, do you know that John Paul II had 4 eyes?
No.
2 on the neck.
I have heard that, actually, yes.
He had that very long prayer of grace after the communion. Too long for a child 4 years old. And once I was at the Holy Mass with the Pope in his private chapel with my wife and my children, and my daughter of 4 years, Chiara, started crying, "Daddy, when is it over? I need to go. I cannot." And I was almost desperate. We were very young. I was not so used to the friendship of the Pope. And I lift up my hand in order to give her a very little and tender slap. And he moves, watches me in the eyes, he blesses us, and he lets us go.
So you were in the Italian Parliament for 24 years?
24 years.
And in both houses?
In both houses.
And did you serve?
And also in the European Parliament.
I was going to ask about that. Also in the European Parliament.
I was there.
And is that when the career got particularly unfortunate? Or was it already unfortunate even in Italy? Well,
I wanted to do great things. Well, something I did, but much less than what was necessary.
I know there was some controversy about you and a commission in European...
At a certain point, I was named by the Italian government to become a member of the European Commission for Justice and Internal Affairs and Vice President of the Commission. But 1 year before, Cardinal Ratzinger had said that homosexuality is morally evil. And an Italian...
Was this the objectively disordered
document? Yes, exactly. An objective moral disorder, not evil, morally disordered. And an Italian politician, Marco Pannella, threatened to denounce Ratzinger to the Italian judges as for inciting people to hatred or something like that. And I said, well, if you bring Ratzinger in front of the court, I want to be with him because I think exactly the same. And of course, they brought neither of us in front of the court, but I became, and I was considered as an enemy by the homosexual movement. And when I went in front of the commissions of the parliament to expose my program, I wanted to speak about migrations. And I had a very good program Now they are reconsidering this program because in 25 years we have done nothing. Now perhaps we will do something. And they did not want to speak about my program. They wanted to know my private opinions on homosexuality. And for a while, I did not answer. I found a way of not answering. It's not, for a politician, it's not difficult. But at a certain point, I remembered the words of God, of Jesus. Those who deny me in front of men, I also shall deny him in front of my Father. And I asked myself, am I denying Jesus Christ in front of men? Am I ashamed of the doctrine of my church? And then I said, in the most diplomatic possible way, I remember the words, I may think that homosexuality is a moral disorder. I may think, not I think, I may think. But this has no impact on my actions because I shall defend the rights of homosexuals as well as the rights of any other European citizen. And then they started a campaign against me in the press and considering me unworthy of being a commissioner. A commissioner is not a member of government.
And you mean human rights, because there was no right to same-sex marriage or anything, was there, in Europe at that time?
Yes, but there is no such a right in the European treatises. The Commission defends the treatises, and I defend the rights of homosexuals in the way in which they are formulated in the treatises, and also in the Chart of Human Rights. And neither the chart nor the treatises contain the so-called egalitarian marriage. You cannot find it there.
Yes.
And then they proposed to me to make a change to another resort, not justice and internal affairs, but something else. And I said, no, if you want me, is it contrary to the European values that one holds this position? I don't think so. Either this or I retire. And in the end, I retired. My government did not support me, and I retired.
The Italian government?
Yes. And at the very end, they wanted me to make a declaration or practically of acceptation of the woke ideology or something like that. And then I remembered I had been on vacation in Scotland with my wife, and we had gone along the whiskey path. Do you know what is the whiskey path?
No.
Oh, you should go someday. There are the distilleries of the most famous kinds of Scotch whiskey. And there are also the most beautiful Scottish castles. And I remember that each one of them had been destroyed sometime between 1689 and in these 2 centuries, 1780 or something. And because Scotland was decatholicized
Yes.
with fire and sword. And in one of them, the Castle of Gordon, there are the last words of the Earl of Gordon. It is easier to sever my head. Well, they brought him to the scaffold, and along the way, they offered him freedom and land if he undersigned the act of submission. And he said, it is easier to sever my head from my body than my heart from my Lord. And then I said, it is easier to sever my bottom from my chair than my heart from my Lord. They did not accept this as an answer.
Well, speaking of chairs, Jorge Mario Bergoglio ends up being elected to the chair of St. Peter in 2013. And so you had known him since the 1980s.
Yes.
So now there are at least, I suppose you knew Benedict as well, though.
Yes.
So that's 3 popes you knew.
Ratzinger was a friend of Giussani.
Oh.
And I was a friend of Giussani. And because of the transitive property, I was a friend of Bergoglio. I can say this because in one interview, not Ratzinger. Yeah. In one of his interviews, he says that when he came to Rome, those who received him and helped him to enter into the Italian mentality were Giussani and Buttiglione.
That would have been when he came to Rome in the 1980s as the prefect of the Congregation
of the Faith.
So did you have a similar kind of relationship with him when he was Pope as you did with John Paul?
No. John Paul was a father. Ratzinger was a friend, but he quoted some of my books. I quoted all his books. But we were together in Communion. Communion was founded by the Italians and the Germans.
Oh, yes.
Prominent German theologians and 4 Italian boys, Angelo Scola, Sante Bagnoli, Luigi Negri, and also Rocco Buttiglione.
So you were involved in founding the Italian edition of Communio, and he, of course, founded the whole thing with Hans Urs von Balthasar and Henri de Lubac.
But Communio was thought as a dialogue between living movements of the Church and the great theology. A little bit as the Latin American dialogue between the bishops, the Church of the Bishops and the Church of the People.
So that's why they had different ones in the various countries.
Yes.
So then Francis becomes Pope, so now there are 3 popes, I suppose, in your lifetime that you knew fairly well. And I'm curious, of course, Americans have all sorts of ideas about Pope Francis, but what was he like in person?
Pope Francis?
Yes.
Well, he's an Argentinian.
And what does that mean?
It is difficult to say. To be an Argentinian means to possess all the virtues and most of the vices of the world altogether. To be stubborn, it is difficult. Do you know the way in which an Argentinian commits suicide?
I believe you have told me this story. He climbs on his ego and jumps off.
Yes, exactly.
I believe I've heard that that's actually a story that Francis liked, a joke he liked to tell. Is that true?
He told. He was. I tell this joke because I have heard it from him. Because Argentinians have a very keen sense of humor, also about themselves. Not always, but sometimes also about themselves.
But he was, as I say, Americans have all sorts of ideas about him and what he was like, and we interpret him through from a long way away.
The main problem is that we try to understand Latin Americans according to the categories of European and United States theology. And in European theology, the main issue is the issue of secularization. This is not an issue in the United States. Even Marxism is considered within the perspective of secularization. In Latin America, this is completely different. There is a very strong popular religiosity, and the main issue is that the communion of the church must become a living community, sociologically, that you can touch. And connected with this is the issue of social justice. And so whatever Pope Francis has said has been read through the categories of a secularization theology.
Yes.
And they were not the adequate categories to understand him.
Did he have eyes in the back of his head too? or anything like that? You mentioned that John Paul, of course.
Well, I don't know. I can say that I was a friend, but I was not so familiar with him like with John Paul. Only I remember. Well, he had the habit of calling people by phone.
Yes.
Yes. And once I was strolling in Villa Borghese in Rome, and I hear the phone. I take the phone, and I listen. Sono Francesco. I am Francis. Why don't you ever answer to the phone? I have seen this book of yours. It was not yet published. Do you mind if I write an introduction? I have been a friend of of 3 popes, but nevertheless, to me, the Pope remains the successor of St. Peter. And so I had almost an infarct.
A heart attack.
A heart attack. And I said, of course, Your Holiness, whatever you want. Good. And put down.
So was the book circulating, as you said, like
among friends, yes.
Yes. So he had seen a copy.
He had seen a copy.
Well, yes, and as you mentioned, the book does have an introduction by, I don't know if you can see it on the camera here, introduction by Pope Francis. And we've been speaking here for...
And he wrote an important introduction.
Yes.
Not just a couple of pages to say he's a nice guy. No, he enters into the contents of the book.
No, it really does seem that he read the thing and thought about it. We've been talking here for some while, so I should let you go. But I would like to conclude by asking, is there anything I have not asked about that you think is worth saying?
Well, what is fascinating in the Christian faith is the mystery of the Trinity. Is it possible that 3 are one? And in my life, the nearest analogy is marriage. The most important thing in my life was that I met Maria Pia and we got married and we had 4 daughters and 12 children. Of course.
Grandchildren.
2 human beings cannot become one in the same way in which the 3 persons of the Trinity become one. They are absolute persons. We are very relative persons. But the mystery of the Trinity can become a reality in marriage and in friendship. I thank God that I could live this experience. I had 1 wife, only 1, and 4 daughters and 12 grandchildren, and I had many friends. I remember I wish to remember one of them, Tadeusz Styczyn. Styczyn was the man who stood nearest to John Paul II. He was his first assistant. I like to say that I am a disciple of Wojtyła, but that is not true, not really true, because Wojtyła was the leader, and Styczyn was the second in command, and I have learned in the direct relation to Styczyn, and philosophically he brought me to Wojtyła. And the last time I saw him, he knew he had Alzheimer. And he said to me, Rocco, this is the last time I can see you. You will see me, but next time I will not be able to recognize you. Don't cry for me. I had a wonderful life, enlightened to the presence of 1 saint and many friends. Well, I consider this as a synthesis also of the experience of my life. Oh, I haven't a wife, which she had not.
Well, thank you very much for telling us about your life, and it sounds like a lot of what you learned started with Luigi Guissani and the idea of communion and Christ being present in the gift of the person to the other, which you found in St. John Paul II in a particular way, and in your wife, and in many other people.
Many other, yes.
And this is a sort of response to the modernity, as you say.
Yes. Modernity has many objections against traditional metaphysics, all this sort of things. Most of them are wrong objections, but they have. But I remember one passage of St. Augustine. Ego vero evangelio non crederem, nisi me ecclesia persuaderetur auctoritas. I would not believe to the gospel if I was not persuaded through the authority of the church. And what is the authority of the church? The sanctity. The authority of the church is the sanctity. I believe because I have met in my life saints, great saints, St. John Paul II, small saints completely unknown, but who nevertheless has had a profound impact on my life. Through them it becomes apparent that it is true that Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead and created the possibility of a new life. The proof of the pudding is the eating. The proof of the truth of the church is the experience of sanctity.
Professor Buttiglione, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
A great privilege to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you.